So I will move on to introducing our first speaker, who is Brandon Taylor. So Brandon Taylor is Professor Emeritus in History of Art at Southampton University and is currently teaching at the University of Oxford at the Ruskin School of Art there. His research interests are extremely broad. They range from early 20th century modern art, covering contemporary art. He is an authority, especially on Russian and Soviet art. His recent books include Collage, The Making of Modern Art, Sculpture and Psychoanalysis, After Constructivism, and St. Ives and British Modernism. So, Brandon, we're so happy to have you here, and we're turning to your talk entitled Truth and Deformity in Modernism.
First of all, test whether this machine is working. Is it turned on? Can you hear me? It's not.
I can hear you. Okay, back there.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you, James and Vid, for inviting me to this wonderful place. The theme this morning is going to be normality and abnormality. Can we lower this a bit? It's getting in the way. Good. Thank you very much. Perfect. We're going to start with Kant, who is in this passage which some of you have been reading in a speculative frame of mind. Consider the case of a full-grown man, he says. The mind can recall the image and shape of an object out of countless numbers of others, of a different or even of the very same kind. The mind can compare, even superimpose, as it were, one image upon another, and from the coincidence of a number of the same, arrive at a mean contour, which serves as a common contour for all. The imagination then allows a great number of images, perhaps a whole 1,000, to fall one upon the other, and thus one gets the perception of what he calls the average man, which, alike in height and breadth, is equally removed from the extreme limits of the greatest and smallest statures. And here we see Kant, the mathematician. The same result, he says, can be achieved by taking the measure of all of the 1,000 and then adding and dividing the sum by 1,000. The result is what he calls the normal idee, the normal idea, something intermediate between all singular intuitions of individuals, a floating image for the whole genus, but which in no single case she seems, that is, nature seems to have completely attained. That is, no single individual is normal or average. Now, Kant's comment that the average size of any genus is equally removed from the extreme limits of the greatest and smallest comes out of Aristotle, the Historia Animalium, where Aristotle, says that the parts of animals of the same genus, birds or fish, for example, are identical, save only for a difference in the way of excess or defect. Within the limits of the same genus, most of the parts exhibit differences in the way of multitude or fewness, magnitude or parvitude, which may be represented as excess or defect. Now, it's those two words, excess and defect, which in the course of subsequent history gave rise to new responsibilities to this idea of the normal. In fact, Kant then qualifies quite quickly his idea of the normal by saying that the figure that underlines the idea of a beautiful man in the country where the comparison is done must have a different normal idée as between a white man and a black man and a Chinese person. And this caveat, this recognition that different groups within the same genus have a different, are conditioned by a different idea of normality, was, of course, to have some interesting consequences, some of them very troubling. A century later, people such as Francis Galton in England, Arthur Batu and Georg Troy and others in the late 19th century were able actually to test Kant's thought experiment. You can see your screens. With the camera by superimposing photographs of a single social group on top of each other and deducing from the composite the physiology of categories such as criminals, lunatics, racial groups such as Jews and Caucasians, and to eventually distinguish even finer characteristics of class and gender within those groups. And on the screen you'll see the figures on the left are composite figures of several Jewish people, which represent, in Galton's allegation, the Jewish type, for example. And even though Galton admitted that his superimpositions were, in some cases, indecisive, the consequence of this type of thinking was that by the end of the century, evolutionary sociology and eventually eugenics came to develop. Well, the talk I'm going to present actually is written backwards in the sense that we're now going to move throughout from later to earlier. We're going to jump to 1945. We turn to questions of art, and we see important modern paintings by Picasso, in this case, exhibited in London in 1945. And we find typical reactions in the press. People deluged the columns of the newspapers with commentary on these paintings, which many people found openly disgraceful. We are shown deformed bodies. One correspondent says, limbs and parts of faces, fingers protruding from the tops of their heads. Some of the drawings are openly indecent. I'm quoting now from some of the press commentary. All respect for humanity having disappeared. Picasso's paintings are messages from the mortuary. Morbid rubbish. That Picasso should pay for a consultation with a good professional psychiatrist instead of getting a free diagnosis from the public. Nice Scottish comment. Well, actually, the general standard of comparison in that type of very vigorous public debate centered around the idea that the standard of comparison, the standard of, as it were, acceptability, really came from the example of Greek architecture and sculpture, in which you find ideals of wholeness, completeness, proportion, beauty, balance, etc., etc. By which standards, of course, by the standards of Pythagorean proportion and classical humanism, Picasso's paintings were very worrying departures. Likewise, in the big Surrealist exhibition in London in 1936, which, this is just a slide to move things on and show you who contributed to the big catalogue. In this big exhibition, works by people such as Miro, Dali especially, show a low coefficient of regression in relation to the strength of unconscious urges expressed. Surrealism, so the psychiatric community agreed with the members of the public, does not provide us with art of a very high order. You just have to read the psychoanalytical commentary on modern art of the day, and it's almost disgracefully uncomprehending. Stanley Hayter, wonderful artist of the 30s and 40s and 50s, compared to the work of a child of 3. I don't have a slide of that. André Breton, who contributed to this big surrealism show, likewise his poem object of 1935, compared to arrangements of stones and tins made by a child, Miro. Freudians, Clownians of every description, simply unable to keep abreast of the challenge presented by some of the work. Picasso's earlier painting, Woman in an Armchair, came in for especially hostile ridicule from this point of view. And the painting that we're going to spend a little bit of time on now, this one by Dali, The Spectre of Sex Appeal, 1934. I hope you can all see it. Can you see it? It's a very small painting, 7 inches by 5. And by any standards, a miracle of patient detail. But just as remarkable for the enormous scale of the vast decaying figure as she towers over the diminutive child on the beach below. Can you see the child? Bottom right. It's a small boy in sailor boy costume who looks up at her from below. We, the viewer, see a female who kneels just, given her withered right foot and her missing left one, with the help of 2 fetishistic crutches that prop her upright against the background of Cap Creus and its rocky beaches just north of the artist's village of Portligat in northeastern Spain. The bulging sacs that form her breasts and the pillow that has become her belly are more than just inanimate replacements for soft female flesh. Their materiality is, and is intended to be, disgusting, as are the rags that stand in for the beach towel that this version of Sex Appeal has taken to the beach. She is unlikely to swim, clearly. But in Dali's thought and writing, she betokens something more. Sex appeal is a newish term, I think probably from American advertising of the day, and the title, Spectre of Sex Appeal, is a mockery of the kind of feminine glamour defined by the market mechanism of that decade. The idea of spectrality or spectre was defined by Dali in an article in Minotaur in 1934, in which he says, the anatomy of spectral woman can be disassembled, taken apart and exhibited separately according to her will. The the dismantleable is both the aspiration and verification of female exhibitionism. Of course, Dali's language, and he wrote a great deal, translates inexactly into what the painting actually shows. But shows to whom? One of the puzzles of the painting is that the small boy's viewpoint is not the same as ours. What he sees is monstrous probably in the Kantian sense of something horribly large, horrible as well as large. Whereas to us, the painting's viewer, the female is certainly enormous, yet she presents a feature that the boy himself cannot see. In fact, two features. On top of the figure's neck, I'm sorry, the neck of the figure's left breast, if that makes sense, we read the sacking as an eerie miniaturized skull in the position where roughly her head should be. And if we try and find her head otherwise than in the necking of the sack, we can only begin to read it in the craggy surfaces of the rocks behind her across the bay, where something resembling a head shape seems to proliferate into a much vaster scale of the wild mountainside. So what Dali's done by dint of continuity of tonality and texture on the one hand, and kind of quite intentional visual ambiguity on the other, is to present us with a picture puzzle which is somewhat different from the perspective enjoyed by the boy on the beach. Does the sailor boy see what we do? The sailor boy is Dali himself, of course. At the very least, he sees an image of sexual decrepitude in the making that he will grow up to wrestle with in his art. My whole ambition, he wrote, a posteriori, after the fact, in 1935, in the pictorial domain, is to materialize the images of concrete irrationality with the most imperialist fury of precision, in order that the world of imagination and of concrete irrationality may be as objectively evident, of the same durability, of the same persuasive, cognitive and communicable thickness as that of the exterior world. By means of pictorial expression, and by means of the most abjectly arriviste and irresistibly imitative art, together with the usual paralyzing tricks of trompe-l'oeil, the most discredited academicism, we can achieve, or he can achieve, sublime hierarchies of thought and a means of approach to what he calls new exactitudes of concrete irrationality. The word concrete is really central to this whole generation. Not just fantastic or imaginary or unreal, but concrete. The collective study of phenomenology, he says somewhere else, and specifically the study of disgust or revulsion, is something that he recommends. There's an important book by an Australian phenomenologist called Colnay, who he almost certainly read, in which Colnay talks about putrefaction, liquescence, the kind of nauseating sense of proximity that you get with sensations of disgust, swarming, insect life, all of these phenomena were colonized themes. And of course Dali liked them all. Think of Chien Andalou. Well, to cut a long story short, this system of investigation became known for Dali itself as the paranoiac critical method, defined as the spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based upon the interpretive critical association of delirious phenomena. Paralyzing, let's just talk about what he calls paralyzing tricks of trompe-l'œil for a moment. In the journal Document for 1930, one of Document's most important critics, called Carl Einstein, no relation to the famous Einstein, of course, at least I don't think so. Carl Einstein published an image of an anamorphic painting, that's on the top, of St. Anthony of Padua embracing the infant Jesus. The significant thing is less the anamorph itself, which you understand the idea you are supposed to look at the painting from some perspective right away on the right in this case, in order to, Vid's in a good position to see it. Just about. Anyway, the important thing is that it was published above two paintings by Dali himself. And my speculation is that neither Dali himself nor a young psychiatrist by the name of Jacques Lacan would have failed to have seen this issue of Document, in which two important paintings by Dali of 1928 are reproduced below this anamorphic image. The first of these paintings is called The Bather, simply Bather, 1928, which takes the form of a giant toe that balloons like a kind of cuttlefish across our view. I'm not going to talk about the big toe right now. That's another subject altogether. And a slightly larger painting, not very much larger, called Female Bather, also of 1928, who appears to be masturbating herself with a kind of fishtail hand, left hand, while her right hand is a kind of gnarled working man's hand with dirty fingernails that makes a kind of slightly obscene gesture. She, the bather, is lying on a rock, sunburnt and in private. Her head is openly Picasso-esque. My speculation is that both Dali and Lacan, either by colluding with Carl Einstein and the editors of Document, had spotted or had become interested in a correspondence between this kind of quasi-anamorphic distortion of the body and and the technique of paranoia criticism itself. Dali, who hadn't even yet qualified as a doctor in 1928, on reading another one of Dali's texts, the one I've circulated to you called L'Âne Pourri, the Rotten Donkey, on reading this text, famously got on the phone to Dali and arranged they met to discuss their mutual interests. And we don't have time really to go into the Lacan side of things here, but his interest in the anamorphic structure of the gaze and the structure of anamorphosis in the perceptual apparatus is a subject probably for another day. Let's talk about Dali. Citizens addicted to decent and reasonable ideas, Dali had said in a lecture in Barcelona in March that year, had better watch out lest I spit on them. His new paintings, he told his audience, were not intended to present anything other than disappointment, foul sensation, repulsion, demoralization, and confusion. They would contribute to the collapse of reality and bring us back to the clear sources of masturbation, exhibitionism, criminality, and love. And now he describes a very specific construction. (1930) A double image. One of a horse that is at the same time the image of a woman. That itself may be extended in the paranoia process by another obsessive idea that can make emerge a third figure, that of a lion, and so on in succession until the concurrence of several images limited only by the mind's paranoiac capacity. He refers exactly to this painting called Invisible Sleeping Woman, Horse and Lion, which presents these three well-formed identities for the painting's central figure, each one requiring some pretty concentrated mental activity on the viewer's part. First of all, to see a woman, a horse, and a lion, and then to see one as the other, or the other as the one. To see the lion in the horse, or the reclining woman in the lion, is to see oneself seeing. And that's really the point. To become, in language that Lacan himself came later to propose, the recipient as well as the origin of the gaze. It is to depart from decent and reasonable ideas in favour not of the dream world, not that version of surrealism, but of the world as possibility. It is to become an active participant in the conscious interpretation of reality according to will and desire. And it's therefore to assume a subject position in which delusion, in the sense of error or departure from the truth, actually plays no part at all. You see the point of this? The idea is to destroy the idea of truth as being something that can be attained without any complication. It's a process in which the viewer's consciousness of him or herself has become, to use a clumsy word, processual, like a process, dialectical, in the temporal unfolding of which opticality itself has become a kind of epistemological journey. Truth, in this hall of mirrors, is no longer to be assimilated to appearances, And unlike dream activity, Bresson and company, in which nothing is willed and which interpretation is supplied from without, paranoia critique becomes the perceptual model for a revolution in consciousness itself. It is in such a mood of vehemence that Dali would insist, in his quite well-known text called The Conquest of the Irrational, that, guided by such an optic, decent and reasonable, could never be the arbiter of which reality to prefer. And just to complete this section about Dali, here is the alleged anecdote about the origin of this paranoia criticism. On the one hand, on the left, you have a picture postcard, top left, which was lying on his desk, turned through 90 degrees, and in which he claimed suddenly to perceive a Picasso-esque head, before realizing that in fact it was nothing other than the picture postcard of some natives sitting outside a hut. Do you see that? And then on the right you have a later painting, slightly later, a few years later, of a paranoiac figure in which that same paranoid double reading is concretized. The paintings of Picasso are hideous, those of Dali frighteningly ugly. So wrote Georges Bataille in the first year of Document publication. And this next part of this talk is about the connection between Dali and Picasso. In the previous year, 1928, Dali had been at the height of his enthrallment with this particular technique of Picasso's, the double profile. And you can see the connection. Picasso, to go backwards by 1 year from 1928, and to talk about him for a couple of moments, had produced this startling painting in 1927. We don't often see it in Europe because it's in the museum in Tehran, called The Painter and His Model, which seems to imagine a grotesque female figure caught in some form of exterior illumination as it flashes into a room. The figures inhabit the last airless gasp of Cubist space, according to a recent reading in a book by T.J. Clarke from the Paul Mellon lectures a few years ago, a space in which the fiction of the picture plane through which we see something beyond it has become in itself spectral, collapsing, in a sense no longer there. The counterparts of Dali's hallucinated spaces seem to have their origin, if we can talk of that, in this formula, this Picasso-esque formula of the painter and his model, where the painter in the painting is looking at the model, painter on the left, model on the right, and yet we, the viewer, form the third member of this triangle. We are looking at the model in a way that makes us unsure whether what we see is what the painter is seeing, if that makes sense. And it appears to me that that is very roughly what is going on in this compositional formula, let's call it for the time being, of Dali's figure on the beach. It is a curious thing that the kneeling female figure, grotesque though she may be, seems to be a shared motif in these years between the two of them. And on the right you can see another painting by Picasso of 27, in which you have the kneeling figure with a kind of grotesquely kind of enlarged left knee, a kind of raised right hand, and so forth. You can see the correspondences for yourself. Like as in Dali's spectral beach figure, she, the figure in Picasso, kneels on one elephantine leg, while the other one appears more like a prop for an elbow-rested arm. Her left hand goes to her single nipple, while her right hand, as I read it, holds aloft what might be a comb, ready to give attention to that hair that flies out behind her. Or there are many other paintings by Picasso of this very tremendously important and inventive period of his life, the years between 1926 or 7 and about 1932, in which you see some of the same bodily distortions and enlargements, the same flying hair. These are two, drawing on the left and a unknown painting, we don't know where it is, of 1927 of bathers on the beach, relating to the period he spent in Cannes in the late summer of 1927. And then you have in the centre a painting called titles have got mixed up there. It's called simply Figure of 1927, the rather darker one, which is, if anything is frightening, this one surely is. Repeating most of the same motifs, the hand going to the nipple, the enlarged or rotting foot and knee, the flying hair, and on the left you have, I think it's one of two sculptures which seem to repeat this kind of posture of the grotesquely kneeling figure. I'm sure some of you know these extraordinary paintings already. And then look at the grimacing smile that Picasso concocts for these figures, again of 1927, I think inspired possibly by glamour photography of the time in which the model's head is thrown back in a gesture of display. Yet another version of the sex appeal of the weekly popular magazines, the width and permanence of the smile, the regularity of the teeth in those two figures, rendered here, I think, from the woman's point of view as being entirely, as it were, fake. And as with the Dali figure, look at the one on the right, her kneeling posture looks to me to be uncomfortable as hell. Well, the question is, what kind of description do such paintings deserve? When they were displayed in the Kunsthaus in Zurich in the big Picasso exhibition of 1932, none other person than Jung launched his famous critique of Picasso's work and described him, Picasso, as engaged on some kind of potentially disastrous descent into the underworld, the outcome of which he didn't care to speculate upon. And this is a whole other kind of theme of the time. Jung admires the artist for attempting to become a victorious personality, but ends up by saying that sometimes these efforts fail, and the one who bursts the shell, he adds, even though this shell is sometimes the brain. Well, let's leave Jung on one side. We can't go there anymore today. It's too much. But let's concentrate instead on the more positive attempts to validate Picasso's worldview, his artistic worldview at this time, which actually seems to come in Bataille's journal Document from the figure of the critic Michel Léris, who makes it clear that Picasso is, his idea is not to remake reality, but rather to express all possibilities, to bring reality closer, even to touch it. His subjects, Léris says, are almost always grounded, in any case never borrowed from the murky world of dreams, nor susceptible of being converted into a symbol, certainly not a surrealist symbol. If one must use the term surhumain, surhuman, that would be in the sense of beings that occupy the height of humanness, not the other side of humanity. They would be rather grandiose creations of mythology, disproportionate, but never, and this is a tremendously accurate comment, I think, never ceasing to feel the earth under their feet. They're neither phantoms nor monstrous. They are creatures unlike us, but the same, though with a different form. And above all, creatures of a marvellous clarity. They are more concrete than us, more substantial, more living. I'm just going to quickly show, but without talking much about, another range of extraordinary paintings, this time the following summer at Dinard in 1928, where you see the human body likewise rendered, in a sense, monstrous, but as the Document critics recognized, I think, rather well, grounded, above all, entirely human, not actually frightening. The bather's body seems to contract and elongate in many cases, carving out strange bits of geometry from beneath the legs and arms. In one case looking like a praying mantis or a crab. In the one on the right, 1928, very small paintings, these ones, about bigger than about 10 inches by about 14. Sometimes morphing into a crab, or in the case of the much grander Nude Standing by the Sea of 1929, a kind of something monumental made of maybe wood or stone. And to revert to the new reading of some of these figures by Clarke, I will just reiterate what I think is something that shows us that he might be on the right track when he writes that in these paintings monstrosity is otherness, alarming and even hurtful, at least potentially, the product of a kind of psychic to and fro between subjects, between male and female preeminently. They are images of identity in the making, of the body turning itself to others. They represent the figures may look flirtatious or exhibitionistic, but they remain at least in Clarke's words, ones in which the question of gender, to come to that for a moment, is ultimately a secondary ascription in which being takes its place. The figures, he says, enact not a personal predicament, that of Picasso, but the human one. They have life. Well, just to end with, and to then give you some time to ask some questions and to complain, if you wish to, about all of this, let me mention that to go back to the beginning, the project of the journal Document, which is the kind of, as you know, the anti-Breton contingent among the surrealists of the years 1929, 1930 and onwards. To this grouping of critics, one of the problems was that of science itself. And here we return to Kant and the project of Enlightenment science, which required and tried to achieve a scheme of comparative taxonomy, normalization, and of course eventually natural law. The whole of philosophy, Bataille said famously, has no other purpose than to give a frock coat to what is, a mathematical frock coat. Mathematics and the scientific method, of course, is what he has in his sights. Mathematics especially, and notably the project of measurement, so impregnated with calculations and constructions, Carl Einstein himself makes out, has science become, as to be no more than an intellectual hallucination, emptied of direct reality, a world of rational but almost arbitrary signs. Any morphology that attributes coherence to anything, he claims, is a measure of our bondage. If the know-alls of science and mathematics want to achieve anything, they must give up their fetishism of unification and place limits on their so-called laws. And familiar mathematical and logical laws, such as the law of excluded middle, that something must either be or not be, must be given up. And beneath the surface of Document is a really vicious attack on this entire edifice of Enlightenment science, which for some reason has not been much noticed or commented upon up till now. Picasso's paintings of 1928, Einstein says, seek no relation at all to sight, to so-called verifiable reality, and none, by the way, to allegory or metaphor. In Picasso's latest works, one is beyond normal. One has pushed aside what he calls biological monotony. Picasso's decisions are not based on the biological canon. They surpass biological conservatism. I'm going to end there, in spite of the fact that there's a bit more. And let me just tell you that, in conclusion, that Bataille himself makes an appeal to an old 18th century book on les écarts de la nature, the deviations or the discrepancies of nature, published in 1775, in which its authors claim to validate or take a strong interest in monstrous productions of nature, namely discrepancies and anomalies. Of course, very much up Bataille's street, and one which leads him to say that, in relation to where we started, that is this idea of normality, being a measure of small distances from the norm. Bataille's argument is that since every individual departs from the norm to some degree, therefore every individual is monstrous. And which is as much as to say that the distinction between the monstrous and the normal no longer has any validity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brandon. So we've got about 12 minutes for some questions. I'm going to open the floor to our students first. So can I have a little show of hands of who would like to go first? Yeah, Dana?
Just bringing this kind of in another direction in regards to gender. So with the surrealists, they really deconstruct the female body. And I mean, you see that in Picasso's with the different shapes, and then with Dali, he's actually using different components. So I'm actually just curious as to what you think their truth is behind that they are trying to tell viewers, especially with the bather. You had said that she's in private, and while she is in private in the actual image or painting, she's actually very public in regards to if it's in a museum or if people are viewing her, which I think is a very bold statement, taking something that's intimate and kind of forcing it upon the viewer in a very obscure way. If that makes sense.
You have to be quite careful with your language. You started off talking about deconstructing. This term was not part of the language of the day. So I don't think it would have made any sense to either of these artists to talk about deconstructing anything.
You said at the beginning of your presentation that when we looked at beauty, we go back to the Greeks, the whole, right? When we're looking at works by surrealists, I mean, I use the term deconstructing because to me, from my view, it's you're really taking the body apart. So I'm just curious as in regards to the female body, what truth are surrealists trying to say by doing that? Is that more clear?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Yes. Well, look at the painting on the screen in front of you. Do you maybe others, or do you especially think that the body is being taken apart in that image? Is that how you would put it?
I would say that for myself, that, I mean, you see the whole of the body, you see the shape, but where the pieces fall, I mean, I'm trying to me that is, it's deconstructed and put back together. You understand that that's a human shape or that's a female shape. But it
looks cut up to me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry.
Can I make a quick interjection? Can I just make a quick... If you could just state your name when you speak, or maybe when you're calling on people, just state your name. So it's sometimes helpful for going back and wondering who is saying things. And just put it... You can put it right up to your mouth. There's all kinds of spit guards and things.
Well, I'm not. It's hard for me to. The painting is not being painted for you in the first place. It's being painted in 1942 in the present case, at a given time and in given circumstances, and against a background of experiment. Let's use that word. Of how to render the body in what way. It surely did you accept that by 1915, 1920, the idea of trying to represent optical truth that is the kind of photographic, let's use that term, of how it appears to the lens, that project was over, artistically. Do you accept that?
Yeah. It's been a long time since I've looked at the surrealists and back as ideal very much.
Picasso was not a surrealist, by the way. Yeah, he was courted by the surrealists, but didn't ever want to belong to them or any other group for that matter. So we're not talking about the body being cut up. We're talking about the body in his way of presenting and reflecting upon the world and the human body within it. We're talking about a project of redescription, of rehumanizing, as I see it anyway. Rehumanizing, what about that for a term? Do you accept that one or not?
Yeah, I accept rehumanizing.
Yes, another question. What's your name?
Abby.
Yeah.
It's not really a question, but just to sort of add that if you think of the Cubists reacting on Bergson and the idea of time.
Yes.
So it's not being deconstructed, it's being fragmented in time and flowing through time versus being taken apart. Yeah. Does that help with the idea of like deconstruction? Yeah. Just seeing it at different moments. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Thank you.
Just to add to the conversation about the idea of deconstruction, I guess to me the way that I would sort of interpret that style by Picasso is that it's taken apart and rearranged, which to me does also seem like deconstruction, but maybe there are different ways of, kind of looking at it. I also had a just clarification type question. So you were talking about the idea of a paranoid critical method. And I was just wondering if this is something that's kind of coming from the artist, where it's something like a specific kind of faculty that they kind of inherit or that they develop. And I'm wondering if with their artworks, is this something that they're trying to kind of transfer to the viewer as they're looking at the artwork?
In the case of Dali, yes. I think the answer is yes. I don't think Picasso was somebody who was interested in paranoia. No, very much not. They were not. They were very different personalities, as you probably know. Didn't particularly like each other or have any particular friendship, although they were both Spaniards. So for Dali, yes, this was the proposition. One that was a philosophical proposition, if you like. Namely, to put it in very simple terms, that so-called reality can be seen in many different ways. And you must try and put yourself back in the kind of thought field of the 1930s, if you like, where, certainly politically, socially, in almost every way you can think of, there were different versions of social organization, different versions of reality being proposed on all sides. Very, very turbulent time. One of tremendous contest and tension. This is the field of culture which we're talking about. Europe in the 1930s. Very problematic and tense, you could say. Yes?
My name is David, also from the University of Victoria. I'm sure I don't need it. And there's, in your presentation, so many directions that the analysis goes. It's almost a little boggling. But my question was also a little bit about this, I think, really compelling notion of a paranoid critical method. I find it really interesting that, actually, if we could go back to, would you mind bringing up the image of the specter again? Sure. And I know I'm going to very poorly paraphrase what I thought some of the things you might have said, but the paranoid critical method fundamentally being a form of anamorphosis, where we can see two or three and infinitely more things depending on the paranoia, according to what Dali says. And there's also, though, this, I find it interesting that this one in particular to me really, especially when you can see the boy, invites a Freudian psychoanalytic analysis, and that those analyses appear to have been the most naively reductive. And then the Lacanian sort of analyses are perhaps more commensurate, at least more sophisticated. And, embedded in all of that is desire, which is a word that's in the writing by Dali. And you had made the suggestion that one of the interpretations of this, the specter is the specter of aging in the future that Dali as the child will face. But what I find interesting when we talk about all this othering and this paranoid critical method is the specter of sexuality here is that, perhaps tipping my personal hand a little bit too much, there's something actually quite titillating about this, which is what I think makes these disgusting, the idea of disgust or repulsion, so fascinating. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how the mechanics of desire, in your opinion, work in the paranoid method to create that frustrating titillation of these abject images.
Well, there's not time for a lengthy reply, but the phenomenon of revulsion, that is the aversion, any one of the aversions, hate, fear, disgust, repulsion, these became, with a good deal of help from the phenomenologists of the 1920s, a very, very important location of almost a dialectical kind of tension, because on the one hand, you think of disgust, think of some rotting food, something Dali was good at, or something melting, slimy. It's on the one hand repellent, but on the other hand it's attractive. We are one, you, me, others may be both drawn to it as well as repulsed by it. And that kind of sensation of double perception of the same materiality, in a nutshell, is exactly the kind of thing that I think almost uniquely in modern thought and maybe in European thought suddenly became of great interest and importance. And you can see its metaphorical potentiality too. This could be applied, as it was later in Sartre and existentialists, to a range of different social phenomena, people, others, the famous handshake, the tree roots, all of that, nature, doubly so, disgusting as well as attractive.
I'll take one more question from a non-student, if you like. So can I have a little show of hands if there's anyone else who wants to ask a question? I'll go for Sam. Sam, I think you had your head up. Sam Rose.
Well, it's not a very kind of full-on question. It's more of a clarification. I just wondered, you move between Dali and Picasso's projects without being that explicit about how you're linking them. I just wanted to ask about that. So as I see it, there's this kind of undoing of something like the stability of an objective visual world, and this kind of realization of multiple possibilities that might be seen in things or things might be seen as. But, for Dali, these images are limited by the mind's paranoid critical capacities, but they're actually kind of demonstration pieces, really. They're things, they're like, a Wittgenstein rabbit, duck. There are only really so many things that you can see in this. It was the sort of lion or the woman or something like this. And this is to do, of course, with them being painted in this deliberately academicizing manner. Whereas Picasso is doing this kind of very different project, this post-cubist project of trying to see what visual truth might be in a kind of more personal sense, perhaps. So I just wondered if you're trying to get at the idea that Picasso is, in a way, kind of pursuing this project in a truer sense, if that makes sense, or in a kind of more logically worked through way, or just kind of how those two things connect exactly?
Well, of course, they're very different in their entire way of working and way of thinking. It interested the answers both, I'm afraid. On the one hand, they seem to share something at a particular time. These group of years at the end of the 20s. It doesn't. You describe these paintings as demonstration paintings. It's kind of veiled disapproval in that term, I think, Sam.
Well,
does it matter?
I don't think we have time for an extent.
No. I was just going to say, it's not disapproval, it's just to try and kind of differentiate them in some way.
Yes, absolutely different. I completely go along with you there. And, completely different, but at the same time, in both figures, this is something I think they shared, terrifically watchful of and aware of the other. Fantastically observant of the changing work of each other, for sure. No, I just thought it was of great interest that they both occupied a place both inside and outside surrealism, both attracted to and recruited by, if you like, both recruited by the surrealists of different kinds and both resistant to being recruited. So they do share certain things, but I completely agree with you, they're completely different figures. It doesn't matter to me that they have the character of demonstrations. I don't. Does it matter to you? Perhaps it does. The use of the academic method, the deliberately out-of-date technique, I think, is one of the marks of Dali's rebellion. Probably have to leave it there.
Actually, I've just been given an extension, which I'm very happy about, for another 5-10 minutes. So we haven't had that. We have a room for another few questions. So do we have any others? Yes. If you can, Nelly.
Yeah, I'm Nelly. And I guess I'm trying to figure out how I want to phrase this question, but it's something about this idea of fear and this idea of the paranoid. And I mean, I do see a lot of fear here, especially fear of the female form, and fear of the liminal in these paintings that you showed us. But I guess my question is just how important the idea of fear or the need is fear necessary and disgust necessary, or is there a possibility that the paranoiac criticism can be done, I don't know, just from a place of being imaginative and pushing the boundaries and finding that liminal that is not disgusting? Is there a possibility for that, or is the fear necessary?
Which of the two figures do you see fear most apparent?
Absolutely this one. Absolutely.
Well, the little boy as well seems to be in a state of, if not fear, then, he's not the happiest camper, I guess.
Well, I don't think Dali ever proposed to represent the kind of ideal unconflicted man. I don't know quite what you want me to say about this. I mean, complicated individual, a complicated psychology, clearly obsessed with conflicting and conflicted feelings about the body, especially the body of the woman, of course. So it goes.
Yeah, I guess my question is more just, is liminality possible without fear?
Liminality You mean...
Because I think that's what the possibility of seeing more than one thing at the same time is a sort of liminal space to be in.
I don't know. Have you ever spoken to a paranoid?
Not to my knowledge. I'm sure I encountered one or two in my life.
We drove up here.
Yeah. I spent 6 hours in the car.
Well, there you are. You see, you'll know that one of the interesting things about paranoia is that is the extraordinary consistency of what the paranoid thinks he or she is perceiving or believing. Every perception backs up every other perception. It is a kind of alternative normality. Do you know what I mean? It's thoroughly systematic and self-endorsing, self-confirming. That's why it's interesting, probably. Yes.
We've just described, not to indicate that I might be paranoid and seeing the same thing again and again, but Vid just described the little boy as not a happy camper, and I think that the formal analysis that you presented astutely focused on certain aspects of it, but I'm seeing, I found the little boy to be a very compelling aspect of it, certainly the least surreal of the aspects. That's obviously representational. And I'm seeing evidence of onanistic fetishism, both anal and genital. Am I the only one seeing the images here? Or how would you speak to the fact? It looks pretty happy to me. I mean, at least on that level. I don't know what he's got in either hand, but I know where the hands are. And
yes, you raise a good point about the hands, actually, and I'm afraid I can't quite make out exactly what's going on there, but I just checked the other day. It's a very small painting, as I told you. It's about no bigger than this big. And you need to go and see it. It's in Figueres, in northern Spain, where there's a big Dali museum.
And bring them
sorry, can I interrupt? Because we have some more questions. Charo, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah. Does this work? Working? I think that your answer to the first question is a good reminder about how we look at this work today, in terms of remembering not to use the kind of framework that, like around deconstruction, that we might use today, because we have to remember that these artists were working in post-Second World War, right?
First World War.
First World War, sorry. I can't see the date from here. So they, around fear and paranoia and dysmorphia bodies, and they're reacting to a horrific time. Wouldn't you say?
Even if I think my answer to that is that even if we knew the personal responses to the First World War of both Picasso or Dali, of either of them, would it do us any good? I'm not sure we'd be any further forward. What we're talking about is the image, the painting itself.
Can I push that a little bit though? So you did say before that that the time is important, that the 1930s are important. Okay, so if not perhaps the immediate aftermath of the First World War, certainly the political and economic context. So I think that what I wanted to ask as well is how you think that sense of horror, the sense of political horror, the horror perhaps of a war to come, does that feature in your analysis of the paranoid or not?
Well, if I was trying to write the kind of cultural envelope of this particular time, these years between 1927 and 1934, I would refer certainly to the threat of fascism in Europe, the threat of ideological division. You just have to think of events in Germany and Spain in the 1929 and 1930, the sense of horror at this, you can use the word spectre in a different sense, of some other version of normality threatening to absorb everybody. And I think that there's no question, to answer your question, Vid, that these and other people in the Surrealist group were definitely, without any question whatsoever, aware of this cloud on the horizon.
James?
Yes, James. In a way, though, I see these as being inspired not so much by horror, but by its opposite. In the 20s and 30s, there was a great culture of healthy living, outdoor activities, bathing, cycling, running. It was all tied up with political ambitions and social concerns as well. And so a lot of these images seem to refer to that kind of imagery, and glamour photographs, as you said yourself.
Yes, it's a good point. I don't know how many of you here have been to this part of northern Spain where Dali lived and worked. But the rock formations and the general kind of ambience of shapes that you encounter just walking across the landscape are extraordinary. I mean, they do really invite images of monstrous shapes emerging from the cliffs and the rocks. They're not like these friendly mountains.
Do you have? Is that the last question, Karun? Yeah.
You can even go to this. You can even go, if you wish to this very beach. It's still there, of course.
Sorry, do they have a?
Was there another hand over there? No.
There's Jonas. There's you. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. I want to go back to your superimpositions of normal and deformity, because I think that is a key that we haven't looked at. And I'm wondering how much specifically Dali was advocating living in this space of considering the other, your emotions of fear, disgust, and through presenting these abstract images, how much he genuinely was interested in living in that psychological space, or exploring it as some kind of productive space, or was he really provoking this kind of move out of the norm, and to say, okay, you need to move out of the space of the normal, but not completely destroy the wholeness in the space of the normal, but, you need to kind of consider other normalities? Or was he saying, I actually love this, psychological kind of terrain of fear and of uncertainty and of, uncertainty between the other and myself, and this kind of push-pull between disgust and attraction. So, because you presented these images of, what might have been called monstrosities, but maybe would be called, our psychology and our perception of change towards people who have, disabilities, or perhaps other body forms now, quite dramatically. And at that time, that might not have been the case. And so you see these, I'm getting that you're making this kind of connection between the kind of psychological, I guess, comportment towards the normal and the norm setting within these social systems, and Dali's kind of rejection of that. I spit on I spit in your face if does he want us to live in the, everyone spits on each other's face world? Or is he genuinely interested in that? Or is he just interested in the artists doing that?
I'm not aware of any special interest that Dali had in disabled bodies, if that's what you're asking.
No, but I mean, it's the psychological terrain I'm talking about. I mean, you can either see it as, listen, it's the artist's role to provoke, it's the artist's role to present this other as part of yourself, and it's to present you with your fears, in a sense, to reflect this part of your psychology or this part of your kind of interior world. And that's the artist's role. That's not necessarily, is he advocating that as like a place to go, as a new normal, or is it just simply an exploration for him?
I've no idea whether he was advocating that or not, to be quite frank. He was a painter, and somebody who was interested in himself, as all painters should be, and of a certain way of seeing. The questions have very frequently been asked about the relationship between Dali and real madness. And Dali's answer to one version of that question was to say, there's only one difference between me and a madman. I'm not mad.
I think on that on that sobering and affirmative note, I think I should conclude. So let us thank Brandon again for a stimulating talk.